I think probably some people feel like we've talked this not to death, but to a point where what more could we possibly learn? But it turns out I know we left things on Friday, certainly with a local purchasing incentive as yet. We still weren't quite sure among ourselves how we wanted to proceed with that. But we've also got some upstanding questions that are really sort of a legal nature regarding the Universal School Meals Program, and specifically around the question that came up through the Agency of Education's hard work on eligibility or whether, as the current law is written this school year, whether there was funding was made available to pre-K and in some cases to childcare programs that were participating with school food authorities under a school food authority were according to the way the language is written for this year, eligible for those payments. And as we're looking at how to carry the program forward to next year, we were asked to make a policy choice. And the policy choice being, do we really want to include those students, those children, as well as the K through 12 students who we all were imagining would definitely be included here. So there's a couple of questions that we're trying to sort through, and we've invited some folks from organizations that deal with this day in and day out, including Hunger Free Vermont, as for the Universal School Meals piece, and then we'll hear from some other folks too. We want to talk during the next hour and a half about both of these pieces, both the Universal School Meals and local purchasing. See if we can answer some of the questions we might have. And I've invited Beth St. James from Legislative Council also, who is here and will be available to step into the witness chair if we need her. But I think I'm going to start by asking Anor if she would mind coming up to the end of the table there. Nor Horton, I don't know if we had you testify this year. Yeah, okay, good.
I'm not sure whether I testified or from the side over there a little bit.
Yes, we do recognize you, and welcome back.
Thank you.
To the committee room. So I'm going to start by asking you, and I'll just say that the two of us had a conversation earlier today so that I could try and get a better understanding of what your perspective was on the way that on how the children that we're talking about from pre-K and childcare facilities might or might not be included in the program going forward.
Mm-hmm. All right, Anor Horton, for the record, Executive Director of Hunger Free Vermont, and thank you all for having me here to dig into this question. So I've done some digging and some interviewing of some different school food service directors who are in this situation that we are describing, where their school food authority, so that's the USDA term for an approved entity that is operating the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs, where their school food authority is providing National School Lunch and School Breakfast program meals to pre-K kids of various ages in various of these different kinds of settings that Rosie Kruger described a little bit in her testimony for you all last week. So, and I think what's important to start out with here is that schools have been, some schools in Vermont, we're talking about a pretty small and limited number of situations where this is occurring right now in Vermont, where a school food authority is providing meals to private child care centers that are approved to operate the state-funded 10-hour-a-week universal pre-K program for 3 to 5-year-olds. And they also have younger children than that in their center, and they're enrolled in a school food authority. So all those things have to be happening, and there aren't very many situations where that is happening. And there's lots of kind of paperwork and rules that have to be followed for a private childcare center to be able to affiliate in this way with the school food authority. And also the school has to agree, the school district has to agree, and has to have the capacity in terms of their staff and all of that to serve that childcare center. They don't have to say yes, you know. So again, this is a limited, very limited number of kids that we're actually talking about here. Okay, but there are situations where this is what's happening. And under these situations, we think that the approach that the Agency of Education took to interpreting Act 151 for this year is the correct approach, and actually is the only approach that is in compliance with USDA regulations governing the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs and their operation when a school is using one of the USDA Universal School Meals provisions, either the Community Eligibility Provision or Provision 2. And these are the provisions that we are required, the Agency of Education is requiring all public schools to use in Vermont under Act 151 in order to make sure that they are realizing the maximum federal reimbursement and minimizing the amount of state supplement that's required. So when kids are in the building, so they're in the school, they're inside the school district in a pre-K program that the school is running. So there's quite a few of these, and they predate the pandemic, and they predate the Universal School Meals Law, and they predate the Universal Pre-K law, right? So there are plenty of schools that operate pre-K programs, and those kids have always been served under the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs like all the other kids in the school building and treated the same as all those other kids. And if the school happened to have been operating a universal school meals program before Act 151 went into effect, then those kids received universal school meals. And in fact, USDA requires that to happen. You cannot exclude any enrolled students, children, from the Universal School Meals provision if you're operating it in your school or in your school district. Okay, so that's really clear. And those kids are pre-K kids and they have been served historically and they have to be served. However, because of the state pre-K, universal pre-K opportunity, and because private childcare centers have been permitted to operate that, and because a few of those childcare centers have been affiliated, in a school food authority, we think, and it's my understanding, although I would urge you to talk to Rosie Kruger and the Agency of Education on this, I don't want to speak for them, but it's our understanding that USDA rules also would prohibit excluding kids from those centers if they're enrolled in the school food authority, like school food service director from Addison County explained to me over this weekend. So she's got this situation where they have pre-K kids in their school district, and they have a private childcare center that's also operating universal pre-K and has younger kids as well. So they have kids 0 to 5 in this center, and they are in their school food authority. When she goes to look at all the students that are in her meal program, all those kids in that center from 0 to 5, they all are listed just like all the other students in her system. And she has to go and have those families fill out the school meal application, even for the 0 to 2-year-olds, right? So they're all included. They're all drawing down the federal money if they're eligible for school meals, all of that. And she's serving all of them with universal meals under the program. And it's our understanding that USDA rules say that if a child is in a school food authority, you can't treat that child, you can't discriminate against that child by treating them differently when it comes to carrying out a universal school meals program. You can't run one of these universal school meals provisions under USDA and then say, but these kids still have to pay for their meals if they're not income eligible. So that is why I just want to admit that we didn't think through this piece. We're kind of used to thinking of the pre-K kids being served by schools as just part of the student body, and we didn't really think this through. And I think no one really thought this through until the Agency of Ed went to actually implement it in real time and had to make a decision. But we think now that we've dug into the USDA rules and we've talked to people who are actually running this program out there in the field, we think that the Agency of Education did the right thing, and that really this is not that different from what schools have been doing. Now, this same school food service director who I talked to in Addison County, they also provide meals to a childcare center, private childcare center, that does not operate the universal pre-K and is not part of their school food authority. And to that center, they vend meals, and that center is not under, right? It's not in their school food authority. Those students aren't listed the same way in her system, and they're not getting universal meals, right? So there is a clear distinction there, and that also seems appropriate to us. But it's when I think the distinction is actually quite simple, and that is either the student is enrolled in the school food authority, in which case they're under Act 151 right now, and they would be under this, whatever the new act will be when you pass it, or they're not in the school food authority and they're not covered. And I think that is really the appropriate approach to take, and a clear-cut approach that would be simple to implement and would be the most proper approach, and would respect USDA rules, which it is critical that we do in order to be able to draw down the maximum federal funding and minimize state funding for the program going forward.
So, Nor, we have Rosie joining us.
Oh, great. I did not know that Rosie was joining us, so.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt your testimony. She has been there listening the whole time, I think. So we'll turn, I think maybe we'll turn next to Rosie Kruger from the Agency of Education to follow that. I wanted to point out a couple of things. You said, you felt that they took the correct and only approach. if I misquoted you, you can step in, but I think that's sort of the crux of the matter here, or the crux of your position. And just to put that in some context, when we heard from Rosie last week or whenever it was, Rosie, again, correct me if I'm misrepresenting anything, but you came to us and said there's a policy choice to be made here, and we'd like you to back to us with a decision on the choice. And now perhaps we're being told it's not a choice, or it's not the same choice that we thought it was. So if that's not accurate, please correct me right away. But if it is, good. We're all making progress in the same direction, and help us better understand what choice we might have or might not have from your perspective.
Sure. So Rosie Kruger, the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Vermont Agency of Education. So what Anor described is accurate. The choice that you have is, are you going to fund those meals or not? So it is accurate that in this situation, the school food authority that has taken on one of these sites that has pre-K kids can't decide that they're only going to provide meals to the pre-K students and not to the 0 to 2-year-olds at the site. But where the funding comes from to pay for those meals is the thing that's up for question. So I have a question into USDA right now. It is very clear that we cannot charge those, or not we, but the child care center, the independent school, or the public school food authority cannot charge families for those meals and still qualify to participate in CEP or Provision 2. But there is a question about, a public school can use general fund to pay for the cost of those meals. In a private school or a child care center, you don't have general fund of taxpayer dollars. What you have is all the funds that you've generated to operate your program based on tuition. And can those funds be used? Our assumption at the agency has always been that those funds can be used. We are double checking that with USDA because we've been asked this question now. Assuming they say yes, that tuition dollars can be used, then it's really a pretty straightforward question to you. Are you going to provide state funds for some of these meals in this situation? Are you going to provide state funds for all of the meals in the situation? And then if you opt to provide funds for some of the meals, but not all of them, then it is up to that school food authority and that site as to how they're going to cover the cost of the remaining meals. And they cannot cover that cost by charging the families a per meal fee or a flat meal fee. But we believe, and again, we're getting confirmation from USDA that they could cover those costs with general tuition dollars, or they could cover it with grant funds or other sources of non-federal funding.
Okay, good. So the question then is now, are we going to pay for it through this program, or is it going to be paid for some other way? But that way is not by charging parents or the kids themselves directly.
You absolutely, if the site is going to be offering universal meals and drawing down those federal funds through CEP and Provision 2, you cannot charge the families a meal fee. You cannot charge the families for each meal. We think right now that you could include it in your general tuition charge, but we're confirming that for sure.
Representative Levitt has a question.
Just a really quick one, which is, what did we do last year? And how many kids, or like how many school food authorities do you think we're looking at, and how many, and to my mind, sort of unanticipated meals, if we do it this way, are we looking to add? And what will that do to the 27 million that we've talked about?
Yeah. So Anor kind of described what we've done this past year, where we gave those, we gave public schools the opportunity to include nonprofit pre-K programs. It's absolutely clear from USDA's rules that a for-profit pre-K program or for-profit school, a for-profit childcare center that has a pre-K program, none of those are eligible for the school meals program. So they're out. But if it's a nonprofit or publicly operated pre-K program, because it's a state recognized pre-K program, they're allowed to participate as a school in the school meals programs under a school food authority. So we gave the public school food authorities the opportunity to include some of these sites if they wanted to under their school food authority, and provide universal meals and draw down the state funds for every paid meal served. And we covered all of those paid meals if the school food authority was a public school food authority, without making them differentiate which of those kids at the child care center were publicly funded or not.
Roughly, do you know how many kids that is?
So we only had, I want to say, like 3 or 4 child cares in this situation in the state this year. And that was really a capacity issue. There were more than that participating during COVID. But as we kind of came into this year with, meals going back in the classroom and, or back into in person, and just schools really struggling with capacity issues, a lot of schools decided that they just couldn't handle continuing to operate that. So if you continued to allow that, then I would see, probably gradual uptake. We haven't done a calculation, but we could figure out how many kids in this, under 5 age range there are in the state. We could apply the same free and reduced percentage we've applied that we have for the older kids. So 34 to 38% qualifying for free and reduced meals. And the inverse of that would be the number of meals you could potentially have to pay for if every child care that has a pre-K, every child in the state under age 5 was enrolled in a child care center that had a qualifying pre-K program, which is not the case. So that would be a very high side estimate. We could do that out. We could work with JFO to do out that estimate. The true number is going to be much lower than that, but it's possible that it starts out quite low, as it is this year with just a couple of centers participating, and grows, as folks have more capacity and kind of universal meals becomes more reliable. You could see that participation continuing to grow over a number of years.
Representative O'Brien.
Rosie, so in the last 2 years, or how long the Universal School Meals has been running, are there any enrolled students under an SFA who have not had access to Universal School Meals?
No enrolled students in a public school SFA who have not had access. There have been, this past year, there were 6 independent school SFAs that went back to charging for meals. And so at those, only the students who qualify for free and reduced price meals have gotten those meals.
So Rosie, thinking about not childcare centers now, but public schools that have within their building pre-K program. And I imagine that even though many students may only be there 10 hours a week, that they might have lunch there or might have breakfast. And that we're envisioning that all of those schools, unless we completely change direction here, would be required to offer to participate in the national programs, breakfast and lunch. And therefore, they would be required to offer free breakfast and lunch to everyone under a universal school meals program. If the legislature were to decide that we weren't going to fund it, so if that's our choice, it's whether to fund it or not, the language in the bill does say that you have to offer these meals. So in that scenario, again, nothing to do with childcare, but this is entirely within the public school setting. In that scenario, funding would have to come from the school's own budget. And
so
from their general fund, if that's the right
What
Okay.
you're talking about is an unfunded mandate to offer universal meals.
I didn't
So
want to say
you-
that, but yeah.
But you have the authority to do, like, you could say, we're going to require that schools offer universal meals to all of their students, or, and you could take that a step further and say, we're going to require that, you know, public schools offer universal meals to all their students, and the state's only going to pay for, this type of meal. But if you do that, then yes, they are going to have to come up with some local funds to pay the difference. And if they're participating in the federal universal meals options, they don't have the option to say, well, we're going to feed some of these kids and not these other kids, and still participate in those federal options to draw down those federal dollars.
Okay, all right. So yes, it's true that even the unfunded mandate dollars come from the education fund because that's the way that we fund education in Vermont. It would be, when we all talk about unfunded mandate, this is an illustration of what that means.
If you tell them they have to do something and you don't provide state funds to do it, that's an unfunded mandate.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Representative Rice?
So Honor introduced a piece that I hadn't heard before anyway, which is that there are pre-K centers being served by a school food authority, but that are not part of that school food authority. And I just was looking for clarification. Is that just happening in the case where it's a for-profit pre-K, or why does that happen when there's somebody being served, a building being served by an SFA but is not?
Yeah, so public or any school food authority can vend meals to another program. They can vend meals to a childcare program participating in the CACFP. They can vend meals to a school that doesn't operate the school meals program, say an independent school that doesn't operate the school meals programs. They can vend meals to another school that's participating in the school meals program. And what that means is they're selling them a meal, but they're not doing any of the other program administration. So they're saying, okay, we're going to serve you this meal. We're going to provide this meal to you. We're going to deliver it to you at this temperature, or you pick it up, whatever. But the agreement to participate in the federal school meals programs, that happens between the agency and the entity that is buying the meal. And the school that is selling the meal doesn't have any responsibility other than to sell a meal according to a contract. So that happens a fair amount, where school meals programs decide, we can't take on all the administrative paperwork for this childcare center or this other school, but we can, it actually works out well for us to produce 20 extra meals and charge a flat rate for that, or per meal rate for that, based on, that gives us a larger economy of scale and a reliable source of income. And so that's quite common and something that is allowed.
Just had a follow-up on that. Rosie, are there any outside of school vendors who provide school lunches or breakfasts? So that they wouldn't come from a school, they come from like a restaurant.
Yeah, so that gets a little trickier. We have had, there are private companies that vend meals, but when you're, as a program that's participating in the federal child nutrition programs, you can skip a lot of the paperwork if you purchase meals from an entity from a school food authority. You don't have to go out and do all the procurement. But if you purchase a meal from a private company, then you have to do a competitive procurement process and manage the contract in a way that is more administratively burdensome. So it does happen, but it has to happen through a competitive bid process versus if you're a childcare and you just want to buy meals from your local school, you can just come to an agreement with them to do that.
Let me ask Beth St. James if she has anything she would like to add to the conversation, and if not, that's fine. But if you do want to come to the table, this might be a good time to do that.
Sure, it'll be very quick, but just to be official. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I think Rosie did a nice job of framing it in that it's not a question of excluding children from a meal. It's who's paying for that meal. I believe that's the question in front of you. For this conversation. I think there are some other ones trickling out there that are maybe not germane to this particular conversation. And I'm with you all afternoon, so we can always revisit it. But I would encourage you to think of the framing of as who's funding, what are you funding? And it's not excluding a child from a meal. The practical ramifications of that may be that there are programs out there that could make decisions to not participate because they don't want to have that unfunded mandate. But that's a large possibility in the universe of possibilities. But I agree with what Rosie said that there were school programs providing universal meals to their students before the pandemic, before you all took this up. And that money was coming out of their general fund. So it's not unheard of for the school district to be using money to pay for free meals for students. It's that outstanding piece that we need clarity on the USDA and how they interpret their own rules for tuition, both from the daycare angle and from the private school angle.
Rosie, do you have a sense just from your own experience how long it might take to get a response from the USDA?
They were very responsive this morning, but this may be more of a question of interpretation rather than a question of the regulation. And that's it. I don't know. It could, we might hear back in the next day or two, or it might be months. So we have in the past, the agency has always interpreted that it is fine for those funds to come from tuition. And so barring additional guidance from USDA, I would continue on with that until we get that additional guidance. But it was clear that that wasn't as straightforward a question as the rest of it, which is, could you as a childcare or independent school charge a meal fee, a board fee? And they said, no, that's not allowable if you want to participate in CEP or provision 2.
So let me just ask a different question now. And we just talked about not wanting to put an unfunded mandate on public schools. The childcare centers are not public schools, and the bill doesn't envision requiring them to participate in either of the programs. They can participate if they want by working with a school food authority. So if we felt that we didn't want to fund some of the children attending those programs, then they would have to figure out, potentially, depending on what the USDA says, a way to fund it themselves. And I'm imagining there would also be some administrative work required, possibly at the agency, but maybe not. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I had gotten some questions about, how would this work if you all decided that you only wanted to fund the publicly tuitioned student, or the Act 166, that's the universal meals funded students at a childcare center, or if you only wanted to fund the pre-K age students at a childcare center and not the younger students, how could this work? And I think the way that we would handle that would be similar to how we handled your direction this past year to fund publicly tuitioned students at independent schools, but not the rest of the students at independent schools. So we had our vendor build a piece into our claim system where we asked on the monthly claim for reimbursement, how many publicly tuitioned students do you have? How many other students do you have? And we were able to do the calculations based on that. That cost us about $18,000 to do that, to build that into the system. I would assume this would be a pretty similar change. That's a one-time cost. Once it's done, then we can continue to use the system that way in future years. So that's kind of what it would take. And then those child cares would need to be tracking that information and reporting it to us.
Yes, Representative Graham.
I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask this question to, but as representative to our contingent, whatever, electives, what is the cost difference to the state pre-COVID to, I mean, we've used federal funds for universal meals the last couple of years. That's going away. So how we were feeding kids before this, and how this, we kind of know 29 million for this. What were we paying before to feed kids?
So previously, the state was officially only, like, from state general funds, you were paying the cost of reduced price student meals. And that was an annual appropriation of less than $500,000. I think it ended up being like $130,000 for breakfast and $200,000 to $300,000 for lunch. Now during COVID, those costs went away because USDA was paying for all of the meals, including the student share of the reduced price meals. Those have since come back. So we're, for the schools that are doing provision 2, we're continuing to pay that reduced price share out of state general fund. And then we're paying the 27 million out of the ed fund this year for those paid student meals, or 29 million appropriated. We think it's going to come in a little closer to 27. In terms of the other state costs, I think I talked in this committee last week about, we have a USDA requirement that we pay out a certain amount of money in state match. That's a few $100,000 a year. That requirement continues. That happened during COVID and continues on. That's been a USDA requirement forever. And then we pay a certain amount of money for things like there's an annual appropriation for state equipment grants. But the real difference in state cost from pre-COVID to now is that you all have decided to start covering those paid student meals. Now, the piece that is really hard to pull out here is that we had pre-COVID I think it's 70 schools, but I would have to go back and double check, that were offering universal meals pre-COVID. And they were covering those costs with general fund, school general, or their own local general funds. And as you know, that ultimately comes out of the education fund. And it's it's a complicated process, and I'm not the best person to speak to that. But you could certainly make an argument that there was a cost to the state of that. It was not a cost that you all were appropriating. It was a cost that local school boards were deciding to take on, and then was ultimately impacting statewide education costs. And I don't have a way of breaking that out for you.
Yes, Nora, do you have you can help us understand that?
Well, I can add a little bit of additional information.
If you wouldn't mind. Yeah. And while you're coming up to the table, coming back to our Brooks, I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned 70 schools.
I might have that number wrong. It's been a while since I looked at how many schools are participating in universal meals pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, but that's not including any districts that were using provision 2 or provision 4, whichever one it is. I can't keep them straight.
That's so we had schools that were participating in CEP pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And we also had schools that were participating in provision 2 pre-COVID. And some of those provisions.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'll let you finish. Yeah.
Some of those provision 2 schools were lower poverty schools. So that was a significant amount of local general fund that they were putting towards the program. while Lenore speaks, I can go look up those numbers for you exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, so we at Hunger Free Vermont tried to get an answer to this question that Rosie was just saying about how much individual school district general fund money was being put into school meal programs pre-COVID. And all that money ultimately is being paid for out of the education fund. So that's the key thing. And we couldn't come to a true number because every school district reported that money in a different way in their school, but their budget documents that they have to submit to the Agency of Education. So it was very difficult. We went through school district by school district by school district, and we still couldn't feel confident enough to bring a true number. However, there is the debt that families incur when they can't pay their school meal program fees. And that was in what we could discern in the school district budgets that we went through, at least $1 million a year, if not $2 million. And that money, because these are USDA programs, if school districts cannot collect that money from families in that school year, they have to cover that cost with their general funds, even if they haven't budgeted for it. So that's money that's being paid for by the Ed Fund ultimately, and, contributing to a really horrible experience for those families and kids and those principals who have to make the phone calls to those families and try to collect that money. And then there are some number of a couple $1 million at least, if not more, money that school districts were putting from their general funds into their school meal programs. And so it's not as much as $27 million. I'm not trying to say that it is, but it was a significant amount of money, and it will continue to be if, that we go back to that situation, because universal school meals is a really effective tool for maximizing education for students, and a lot of school districts are committed to it. And so there was a significant amount of money going toward school meals out of state funds. I think that's the basic point I want to make here.
Yeah, Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, going back to Representative, Graham's question. So worst case, because I think having that number matters when we're trying to sell universal school meals, and I have said I'm a strong proponent of that. But that numbers matter. So the worst case answer to Rodney's question, or pardon me, Representative Graham's, is it costs $500,000 plus $2 million for non-paid debt, so call it $2.5 million. And then you keep talking about this undocumented, there's no true number. Let's say you can't get a fixed number. Was it 5 million? Was it 15 million? Because we're saying you need to pay an additional 26.5 million and justify it, or it's in real numbers, it's only an additional 16 million or 15 million. Mm-hmm. So I think that number is important. Mm-hmm. Just because transparency, we can battle it out on how the effectiveness of education is advanced exponentially from this program, but I think the number would be nice.
I agree with you.
In our
I agree with you, and that is why we tried to get to that number. And I'm just telling you that we don't have enough confidence in it to come here and officially declare what we think that number is, because we didn't feel that we could sufficiently interpret school district budgets. They reported that funding in all different ways, in all different lines, and we couldn't always distinguish what that is. And so I just can't give you that number right now. We can, and I don't remember off the top of my head what we kind of approximately came to in 2021 or whenever it was that we last looked into this. But I will go back and see what we did document, and I can provide that to the committee.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you get credit for trying to wade through the various ways the different districts report their expenses. Representative Graham, did you have a question? Comment?
No, just kind of a follow-up. I mean, we can say, oh, it's just going to come out of the education fund, but the education fund is funded through property tax, sale tax, all kinds of taxes. So it is going to affect a lot of taxpayers.
Yes.
Some are struggling to feed themselves. I'm going to ask them to, but let's just say $20 million more into feeding school kids. I mean, I know they make their budget less if they don't have to feed the kids, but it's still going to cost the taxpayers a tremendous amount of money. We kind of need that number if we're going to try to sell this to not get hung tree.
Yeah.
Rosie, did you have Mike off there for a moment?
So I did find the actual number. I told you approximately 70. So we had pre-COVID 54 public schools and 4 independent schools set up to operate CEP, and 13 public schools operating provision 2 for both breakfast and lunch. And then we had an additional 4 public schools operating provision 2 for breakfast only, which is an option. And so yeah, those are the numbers for you. And I'll confirm what Honora is saying. You know, theoretically, there are these places where we could see what those local general funds, again, ultimately coming out of the education fund, would be. And she's right about unpaid meal charges. And then lots of school districts do put in a general fund transfusion, but it's difficult based on the reporting that the schools were doing pre-COVID to go back and identify identify all those different pots of money. We had an annual financial report that the schools did for their school meals programs that didn't used to break all of this stuff out. We've since actually added a lot of fields to it and made it a lot more extractable. So going forward, we can pull all this information, but we didn't have it available before a couple years ago. And then the Unified Chart of Accounts is the other place that I think that we had looked. But again, depending on whether it's a contract with a food service management company or an in-house independently operated program, it may have appeared in a lot of different ways in the school's budget. So it is very difficult to pull down. We did provide some information a couple years ago to the Senate Agriculture Committee on unpaid meal charges. We didn't have information statewide, but we had information from a number of SFAs where we had done administrative reviews. And so I'm happy to share that with you all if you haven't seen that, to give you some sense of unpaid meal charges pre-COVID. I would imagine going forward that if you were to stop doing universal meals, we would see, based on other states' experiences, we would see unpaid meal charges go up significantly from pre-COVID, because you have many households that are not used to submitting applications at this point. It's, it's kind of no longer the practice. And so we have heard from a lot of states that did go back to charging for meals that unpaid meal charges nationwide are way up. I don't have a percentage to tell you or a way to do a calculation of what ours would be, just to know that they're higher than they were beforehand.
Representative O'Brien?
Is there data for pre-COVID, what it costs to feed students in Vermont and what it's costing now? And then like a pie chart. So pre-COVID, it's like federal government, the state and parents. And now it's, it'd be interesting to see those two. So then I don't know if we get to Rodney's number, but it would be interesting just to see that bump up and who's paying for what share pre-COVID and now.
And we could extrapolate who was paying what before COVID. One of the confusing pieces of it is that the per meal cost increases with inflation. And so we've had significant inflation over the past few years. So I'm happy to work with folks to try and figure something like that out, but it's a little tricky to nail down.
And we are working on some data that will answer maybe your question, or to some degree your question. So we'll be getting some additional data together. It's just the lag in getting data, and then our effort to calculate these things is just taking a little bit longer, but we are working on questions like yours, if not exactly that question. Yeah.
Representative Rice.
I would just add that the number of sort of what the state was spending pre-COVID, including all the things that we can't quite add up, is less relevant in light of the fact that schools have all been offering universal school meals for 3 years now, and I think probably a lot of them will be unwilling to go back. And so more of them will likely be pulling that money from their general funds. And so that number will probably be much higher than it ever was before. And we couldn't even quantify what it was before. So it just feels like not a super relevant number. And it would be sort of, in essence, allowing universal school meals to play out in lots of places, but in a much sort of less equitable way, and in a way that we have a lot less control over in terms of making sure that we're requiring the maximized drawdown of federal dollars and all the other things that we can do if we make it a program that we are talking about at the statewide level.
Representative Wilson?
It just seems to me that all the data, all the information, the cost of education is way too high. And universal free meals is just going to add to inflation. There's going to be more people that can't pay bills, and I don't see anything good coming from it. I mean, how's everybody going to pay for it? Just magically?
So Representative Cole, I think you had your hand up.
Sure. I just wanted to validate the concerns here about, taxpayers, any unexpected increment there, and being, of course, in making the decisions that we're making right now, we need to be very conscientious of that and what in reality would those numbers look like. And I think Ways and Means, of course, will have a, better ability to actually show us, because of course we're talking in a good amount of hypotheticals being in our committee. But one piece that I found interesting in looking at like the breakdown of the ed fund in total, and how we spend the ed fund dollars. I never want to compare apples to oranges or anything, but I think it was like 2022 or one previous breakdown was that 227 million is allocated to special education funding and supports for that, which is incredibly important. Obviously, that's a huge number. But I thought about that compared to 27, like 227 versus 27 million, and just the difference there. Again, never wanting to compare the importance of either, but that to put it into perspective a little bit.
context, yeah. Rosie, while we have you in, just one other question that I had, I thought maybe Representative Levitt would have asked, but
What's happening in Grand Island?
no, not a Grand Isle question. No,
Repeating kids in Grand Isle is what's happening.
no, whether there's any new information from November or any other month, I guess, that would help you and JFO, I suppose, figuring out so far what uptake has been.
Yeah, so we do have the November meal counts now, and they were slightly lower. Average daily participation was slightly lower than October. So I think we're feeling fairly confident that we're not going to see this school year, a huge increase in participation that's going to make this year cost more. I still would anticipate that over time, as some of those issues that I discussed, that the agency discussed in our report, that might be driving down participation, as some of those are alleviated, we might see some uptick in participation over future years. But I'm feeling pretty confident that we're not going to see a huge increase this year. And then among the categories of participation, which was the other piece that was important for determining costs this year, we were seeing that free and reduced students were participating at a slightly higher rate in comparison to their overall percentage of the student body compared to paid students. And so that was also making us feel more confident about that guess for how much, that estimate for how much this year would cost. So I think we feel like we're kind of on track to meet that estimate, and no concerns that we're going to go over the amount that was appropriated this year.
Okay, Representative Levitt?
Can I just ask a really simple question? Regardless of the pre-K and all the school food authorities, how confident do you all feel that 27 million is the right number for moving forward?
So I think you had a presentation from JFO, from Julia Richter, and she provided a chart at the end of the report from JFO about estimates going forward. And we provided some of the information to come up with that estimate. And I think it was a range. And I want to say that the maximum was 31 million on that range. And so that was accounting for a increase in participation, also accounting for the per meal reimbursements increasing by inflation, and two other factors in that range were assuming that the Medicaid Direct Cert pilot is as good as we think it's going to be, and that would be reducing the cost to the low end of the range, or if that is not as good as we think it's going to be, and in fact we have to stick with the numbers that we got this year, that would be the high end of the range.
So the October numbers from that report say roughly 28 million at 34.85%. So you're saying November numbers were lower than October?
Very slightly lower than October in terms of annual or average daily participation.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm sorry, can I just add one quick thing? Kenny Wozniak with Hunger Free Vermont for the record. I think this might go without saying, but when we're talking about millions of dollars, whatever the number was, that the state was spending through the education fund on school meals before COVID, we were not feeding all of the kids under that model. That was the model that allowed kids to fall through the cracks. That was the model that allowed for families who may not be economically secure, but whose incomes were above the threshold for free and reduced meals. So when we're talking about spending $29 million or $27 million, that achieves feeding every single student in a public school SFA across the state of Vermont. Whereas beforehand, the state was spending many millions of dollars to feed some of the kids, while many other kids were still falling through the cracks and not getting the food that they needed at school. And I think that's just to Representative Rice's point about whether or not we can adequately compare the money pre-2019 and post-2019. I think that's just something important to keep in mind, is that right now, everyone who attends a public school school food authority in Vermont is getting fed, whether that's through a school meal or through they're just bringing their lunchbox from home the old-fashioned way.
So Representative Grant.
I'm not against feeding kids, okay? But you have to be aware there's going to be a significant input of cash. It's going to have to be paid for by Vermont people. And we just need to be aware of that. Because more likely you'll see a property tax increase of a significant amount to pay for that. People need to know that.
Representative Templeman.
If you're like me and you believe that skipping a meal is not an ethical way to save money, or when faced with economic problems, you would believe that you're going to be eating 3 meals a day, no matter what. You're going to be paying for that meal anyway. So whether it comes in tax dollars or it's handed over at the grocery store, this isn't money that's coming from, we're not talking about a program that we would be spending money on if the money weren't already being spent. We're spending this money anyway when we go shopping for our kids, and it costs more to do it that way. It costs $1 more a meal to prepare that bagged lunch ourselves than if we work together as a community, as a state, and buy that money and pool our resources and do it together. Okay, it comes from taxes, but it's going to have to come from somewhere anyway to feed these kids. Sorry, I'm getting a little upset.
So let me just take stock for a second here. Here's what else I think we need to do today. We want to bring this conversation to a point where everyone's comfortable stopping for the day with it. We have some other witnesses who could speak to us about the other policy area, the local purchasing incentives, and how we define local and what we want, what else we might want to do there. And then if there are things that anyone wants to say or ask regarding the conversation we had earlier this afternoon around payments for ecosystem services, I want to allow time for that. All that could take us, I suppose, well into the late afternoon, and
Evening.
conscious of that. Continue plowing through, or we could take a little break if people want to have a stretch, and if the witnesses are okay with that, and then come back and pick up where we've left off. So throwing that out to you all, how would you like to go forward here? Little break or keep going?
Little break.
Little break. Okay. Let's start again